Good morning. Today we look at Joshua 4, 5, and 6. The Israelites have crossed into the promised land, crossed the Jordan on dry ground, and God says to Moses, select 12 men and have each of them take a stone from the middle of the river, put it on their shoulder and carry it to the shore and make an altar there, make a pedestal, a mound, a pile of these rocks, stones to commemorate the crossing. And as I read this again, I thought, well, first the stones are on the shore, in the ground, and then all of a sudden, no, the stones are in the middle of the river. And I looked through it, and yeah, it's both. And so, which one of it is? I don't know for sure, but I would guess the one on the dry ground, because the one in the river would be covered up again. Anyway, but they do as God says to do. And they make this a pillar of rocks that way. And it says, the verse 10, the priests who bore the ark remained standing in the middle until everything was finished. So until the rocks have been carried and piled, the priests carrying the rock are still there. And then verse 13, about 40,000 armed for war crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho. And on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of Israel, and they stood in awe of him, as they had stood in awe of Moses all of his days. And so, I don't know if they're really in awe of Joshua, but in awe of God for sure. And then I think about this, as we, get down, chapter 5 begins with all of the kings and all the people, being frightened, and shaking in their boots, and because of, this, what God has done and led these people to stop the river and all of that. And it makes sense, right? If that happened today, we would sit back and take notice as well. And for these, primitive warmongering people, I don't know if I should say it that way, but, they fought with swords and knives and hand to hand, and for them to think about this people, these Israelites are coming, and they've got this God who stops the river, and how could you stand against something like that? I can understand why these other nations, these other peoples were, fearing these Israelites and their God. But, before we actually get to that part of it, in verse 19 of chapter 4, it's the people came out of the river on the 10th day and camped there and set up in Gilgal. And it's, they're there on dry ground. And the stones are there as that reminder, just as the Passover is there as a reminder. And and they celebrate, they've crossed over this Jordan just days before the celebration, the observance of Passover. And so they will observe Passover here as well. But before that all happens too, there's another big step that happens. They're at Gilgal. And these Israelites have been traveling for 40 years and have not followed the instructions of the Lord to consecrate and circumcise the male children on their 8th day. So all of these men now have not been circumcised. And the God says, circumcise all of the men. And I just, really? Wow. And of course then, so they are all circumcised. And they did not travel, until all of those who had been circumcised were healed again. But still, it's just, while they've been traveling, it's been an exception for God. He's let them not follow the command he gave them. But now let's get back on track with things. And then in verse 10, while the Israelites were camped, they kept the Passover on the evening of the 14th day. And on the day after the Passover, they ate the fruit of the land. And after that, there was no more manna. For those 40 years, God had faithfully provided the manna and all of the nourishment, you know, in this flaky white substance, everything that they needed to live, to survive, to travel, it was provided for by God that way. But now they eat the crops of the land. And then verse 13, now we start the conquest journey. Joshua standing there, and he looks up and sees a man standing with a drawn sword. And Joshua goes and said, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" And he replies, "Neither, but I am the commander of the Lord's army." Wow. Think about that. I am the commander of the Lord's army, of the army that the Lord have now come. And, you know, and again, this would put fear. I mean, to think about the power of this God to stop the waters. And then now here, you know, the Lord sends a man. I am the commander of the Lord's army. And again, as we're in the season of Easter and we're getting closer to that time, you know, when Jesus is on trial and, you know, I could call down a host of armies from heaven, you know, but, you know, here the Lord's army, you know, and, you know, there are songs that I grew up singing. Onward Christian Soldiers is one of them, and, you know, marching on as to war. And you know, these are songs that they don't really want us to sing anymore. But I think about that. We're in the Lord's army, fighting against the devil, fighting against Satan. And they take away some of this beautiful imagery of that, you know, fighting with the Lord against the devil. And so often then, I mean, it just, you know, just we're on our own? No. I mean, we forget that we are family of God, the army of God, and that the power of God is with us. But anyway, the commander of the army is here. Joshua falls to worship, and he's asked, "What do you command your servant, my Lord?" And then it's, "Well, remove your sandals, for the place you walk is holy," and he did so. But then now we come to Jericho. And this battle of Jericho is quite a deal as well. Before I go there, they're at Gilgal. And my Bible has a footnote that says it's also known as the hill of the foreskins, where they were circumcised. And as I read that and thought about that too, I get this grin, I get this laugh, because there's a beautiful song. There is a balm in Gilead that makes the sin sick whole. And you know, you would need a balm, you know, in Gilead, this hill of the circumcisions, the hill of the foreskins. And it's just one of the silly things that comes to my mind, you know, of how, you know, we use a balm to heal. You know, Vaseline, we use a lot of different things, Vicks Vapor Rub, you know, there are so many soothing balms that way. And, you know, the balm of Gilead, that's Jesus that comes to make the sin sick whole. That's the image of it anyway. But just one more of those little asides that my mind goes on sometimes when I'm reading and thinking. And now God says to the Israelites, Jericho is a walled city, and people are staying there. They're not coming and going. The fear is in them because of what they have witnessed with the Israelites crossing the Jordan and with everything happening. And God tells Joshua, "I'm going to just deliver this city into your hands, and I'm going to do it this way. You know, take the priests with trumpets made out of ram's horns and march around the city 6 times in the morning. Do that for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, march around it 7 times, blowing the horns, but making no other noise. And after the 7th time, when the horns are blowing, then tell all the people to shout, and the walls will fall down, and then you can go in, the army can go in and totally, you know, annihilate the city and take possession." And it sounds like, what? How, you know, and, you know, these walls are thick, you know, and remember, you know, Rahab's house is on an outside city wall and all of that. But, you know, and the people do that. You know, they march around the city. And So it starts with, in verse 7, to the people he said, go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass before the ark of the Lord. And they commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord, blowing the trumpets, the ark of the Lord following. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came, and they did as the Lord said to them. And I am thinking, who would believe such a plan? Who would believe such a plan? But when you've just witnessed the parting of the waters of the Jordan, yeah, let's give it a shot. And it comes to pass as God had said. And after the walls have come down, the only place that's still standing is where Rahab and her family are. And they go, and the people of Joshua sends those 2 who had been the spies to Rahab's house, and Rahab and her family, the Canaanites, continue to live in the land of the Israelites. And so, God is faithful to his promises. He's leading the people into the promised land.